Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how the Tories are trying to claim that the public sector pay awards being proposed and accepted by the new government will be inflationary, but their argument is now falling down. It was never true, and now the Bank of England, which had always hinted at the untruthfulness behind it, is able to explicitly say, no, it's not going to stoke inflation. So as we saw soaring inflation rates over the past few years, the Tories kept insisting, oh, we need wage restraint, or the problem will be way worse. And some of them asked, okay, so why at or above inflation pay awards would stoke inflation, but well above inflation executive bonuses and corporate profits would not? But although the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, at the time was urging wage restraint, the Bank of England's reports were not making the case for it. They weren't laying the blame for any part of our high inflation on wages. In fact, mathematically, if it's an at inflation pay award, how does that stoke inflation anyway? So there was never an excuse for that. But now there's a different government. Pay review bodies are recommending pay awards of an average of between 5 and 6% for public sector workers. And at the moment, we've got a CPI inflation figure of 2%. That's the one that would be reported in the media. We've got a core inflation rate of 2.8%, which means the pay awards are going to give you about an average of 3% in real terms, give or take. So mathematically, you can make your argument, oh, well, if pay awards are above inflation, that could drag inflation up. Okay. However, before we get into the politics, let's look at the maths. Even if you give every worker in the country, like public and private sector, every single one, a 3% real terms pay increase, that cannot possibly raise the inflation rate by 3% because there's other money in the system as well. So the inflation will always rise by less than the pay rise, meaning those workers will always be up on the deal. It's true that the public care about inflation. Unfortunately, they hate maths, so don't think of it in these terms. But when people do care about inflation, they care about it in so much as it affects their spending power. So if you say to a person, okay, your costs are going to increase by 1% as a result of this thing. It's like, oh, that's not good. But your income will go up by 3%. Oh, that's fine. We don't have a problem with that. But now we have a figure. The Tories have started wailing about these pay awards stoking inflation, like when they were doing it before. Would it be nice if the Bank of England had have said, okay, so if we give pay awards that allow people to at least keep treading water, how much would that raise inflation by? How much? We never got an answer for that, because if you'd have asked the Bank of England to calculate it, they would have had to have said, well, not really at all. But now they have. The Tories are wailing about these pay awards stoking inflation, but there are two small flaws in their logic. First, the pay awards, it's not like Labour going, oh, let's just give them a load. They've done that for junior doctors because they were, really badly affected. But mostly what the Labour government are doing is pay awards as recommended by the pay review bodies. And these are groups who had their guidelines set by the Conservatives, because the process began long before the election. So the Conservatives were in power when they were following those guidelines. So in order for the Labour government to not meet these pay increases, they would have to dismiss the calculations the Tories said were appropriate. And I think Labour should probably make that point. Every time a Tory stands up and says, oh, you shouldn't be paying these, I would stand up and say, I'm using your calculations, mate. Second, the governor of the Bank of England, without a Tory chancellor breathing down his neck, has now explicitly said that the pay awards will not stoke inflation. He said it would add at the absolute most 0.1%. So that's absolute most. He actually suggested in reality it will be like, not even a tenth of a percent, hundredths of a percent. He said that the bank are not even talking about these pay awards when they're talking about inflation. They just don't consider it a factor. And it's worth noting that the bank cut interest rates yesterday. The Tories are trying to claim that these pay awards would put the interest rate cuts expected in jeopardy. But the bank voted to cut interest rates yesterday when the government had already explicitly said it would be honouring these pay award recommendations. So they'll have factored that in. So as far as any members of the public will be able to see, we've gone through a period of a few years of interest rate rises, which went alongside wage restraint, creating a cost of living crisis, which contributed as much to the worst Tory result in a general election ever as anything else. And now we're going to get a period of wage growth, which is also set to coincide with interest rate cuts. Now, obviously, there are other factors at play here. But, in terms of the politics, the political game, that's the point I'd be making. Certainly what we're going to see in the next few years is wage growth, and we're not going to see inflation get out of hand. We are going to see GDP growth. We are going to see interest rate cuts a bit. I mean, they're not going to go back down to where they were. And Labour would do well after a suitable period to point this out. We're going to have a few years proving that wage growth doesn't stoke inflation. We already have the Bank of England saying it won't. So I'd like to see Labour making the argument loudly and regularly to the public that the Tories lied to them about wage restraint, because that can then lead to questions about, once you've established that wage growth doesn't lead to inflation, you can then ask the questions about why the Tories would ever say it did. Why were they promoting low wages, especially when they kept talking about a high wage economy when pushing Brexit? Well, there are a few reasons. The first is simple ideology. Public sector pay is seen as an expense, and they like the state to spend as little as possible, so taxes can be as low as possible. And because they don't understand economics, they only ever see public sector pay as an expense. It's never an investment for them, which is why our economy has shrunk 18% in real terms since they've been in power. Second reason is that they're really on the side of bad employers in the private sector. Better pay in the public sector means more competition for workers across the country, which means, of course, the private sector, which means private business owners have to offer higher wages or better conditions in order to be attractive. Suppressing public sector pay helps increase the supply of available workers for lower wages in the private sector, and therefore helps bad employers. And third, the Tories want public services to fail in order to make the case for more privatisation. Not that you could really imagine much more privatisation than we already have. But suppressing public sector pay drives workers out of the sector, as we've seen, whether to the private sector or just other countries. Like Ireland pays way more for doctors, for example, than we do. And Brexit didn't take away our right to live and work on the Emerald Isle. And I would be making all of these points if I were part of the Labour government or campaign machine. And at the next election, I would be pointing out the period of economic stability, the lower inflation rate, the stronger growth, and emphasise the fact that it all happened by paying workers properly and removing tax breaks for the wealthy. Make the point that wage growth doesn't stoke inflation. You'll be able to prove it in a few years' time. Make it so loudly that the Tory lies won't be able to work again for decades at least. The Tories need to be shown to have stolen people's standard of living. Not failed to provide it. That's incompetence. People sort of forgive incompetence, particularly when you change the individuals involved, which the Tories are going to do anyway. Actually make the point they deliberately stole it. They told you wage restraint was needed to get inflation down. Labour will have proved it was not. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.